How can this Chord Qutest provide the same sound quality as one of the large DACs behind me, such as the Shit Audio Yggdrasil or Audio GD R27HE? Well, let's find out. Chord has always been known for their quirky designs, and that is much the result of John Franks, who designs their amplification, as well as Rob Watts, who designs their digital to analog gear. Now, in the case of something like the Qutest, it uses quite a radical change of technology compared to your average digital to analog converter. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about the technology inside this and explain why it is so small. And also I'm going to compare it with some of the equipment I have behind me, such as the Shit Audio Yggdrasil, and also Chord's own Hugo 2, which I use for portable evaluation, and some other gear I have on hand. I'm also going to answer some questions people have about whether it improves if you use a better power supply with it, since it is USB powered. And then I'm going to give my opinion on the value of this DAC. So stay with me as I go through this journey of looking into this digital to analog converter and how it can be so small and do a very good job of producing good music reproduction from computer or CDs. To start with the technology inside this thing, well, your normal digital to analog converter uses something like some kind of digital filtering chip and then a digital to analog converter chip. Nowadays, most of these are all in one chip, and they are controlled, with various settings such as the kind of digital filter used and the like by the designer, which enables or disables some of the features and sets everything up to work well with it. And of course, that means with you inside a digital to analog converter, you have usually a large power supply, and that power supply is split into groups so that you have different voltages for different sections of the power supply, such as the digital inputs, which may need their own power supply for optimum performance, and as well as the digital conversion, and then the analog outputs, which will require maybe a higher voltage and current that goes through digital circuits. The more complex these things are, the more that they separate out the individual requirements for each circuit, and the less likely you are to have distortion created by them, especially as you don't want things like high frequency noise coming through from your computer or whatever source you're using and going through to the analog outputs, as that will degrade the sound. Now, we're not just talking about measured performance here, like sticking a 1 kilohertz sine wave through and then sticking up on a graph about who can get the best measured performance in a converter from 1 kilohertz. We're talking about reproducing music, and that's one of the primary things that goes on with digital to analog converters. Now, a lot of people these days have found modern digital to analog converters to sound, well, they say unmusical. It doesn't feel like you're listening to real instruments. So people have often resorted to using R2R DACs, which are old school digital converters, such as actually 2 that I have sitting behind me, or I actually have 6 sitting behind me, but that's another discussion. However, a lot of those sound more, well, what people call musical, or what people think sounds more natural, by the fact that the old school digital to analog converters do introduce some degree of distortion, pleasant distortion like harmonics and third order harmonic distortion as well, and they are very pleasant to listen with. And the fact that I have a set of them here, one of my favorite DACs, actually does have, well, technically a lot of distortion, probably says much to that. However, so in between, what do you do when you have on the one extreme the very technically accurate DACs that don't really sound like you're listening to music, and then you have very, well, inaccurate DACs that sound, well, more natural but are, well, to some degree, you're going to distort things? The answer comes in what Rob Watts has designed for DACs such as the Qutest. Now, one of the factors of, say, an off-the-shelf digital to analog converter chip is that the designer is limited to what is available on that chip. So what manufacturers have been doing is they have been employing FPGAs, which is basically like a kind of computing chip which they can program with their own digital filter designs. It can also do the other things like manage the control interface for the DAC and other features as well. It can all go inside there, and they separate out each part of the FPGA to do each function. And that way they can implement much more powerful and much better quality digital filters, but they're still using the digital to analog converter from a company like ESS Tech or AKM or Burr Brown / Texas Instruments or even Cirrus Logic. And the problem with that is these converters output not only the music, but a lot of high frequency noise, and that has to be filtered out. And the more analog components in there you have to say filter out things like high frequency noise, the lower the quality of the output signal. Rob Watts takes that a degree further by having his own discrete component DAC, which he designed himself. So it's actual components. So the digital output of the FPGA in this goes into a special component DAC of his design. And using a number of other technologies that are probably too much to go into in this video, or you can read about them online, we see his presentations he's done or things he's written up on forums. The result is he can get much lower distortion and a much more real sound. So we're not talking lower distortion as in just low total harmonic distortion numbers. But one of the things he has aimed for is actual timing accuracy in the music. And the problem with a lot of digital filters is they don't provide the timing needed for our ears to discern where, say, instruments are in a space. And that's one of the main things that the Chord DACs are known for, is that they reproduce the instrument and musical space as it actually is, or as far as is physically possible, given that the analog to digital converters that often digitize music do cause some of the distortion in the first place. Now, we can't undo what an analog to digital converter does, despite the claims of certain companies which are now defunct because they said that they could do something which is impossible, but we can do the best to reconstruct the original waveform from the audio, and that's what Rob Watts aims for. And he uses an extreme amount of computing power in the Qutest and his other DACs. So for example, your normal DACs, such as the ones behind me, will have, say, up to 8 times or 16 times oversampling. That is, for each sample in the music, they'll add 8 to 16 extra samples to reproduce the analog waveform as smoothly as possible. Well, these DACs use 2048 times oversampling, and as well as a number of other digital filtering methodologies, and where there are volume controls involved, noise shaping. And so the quality of the digital filters in this are quite extreme. And the result of that, well, let's talk about the design of the Qutest first, and then I'll talk about my impressions of the sound as a result, and of course comparisons to other devices. Well, the cool thing about the Qutest is there's not much to show. It has a couple of buttons on the front. The first one changes the digital filter. Now, the default digital filter will give the maximum quality possible, but there's also a second digital filter which will cut some high frequency noise. The use of this filter is, well, it's kind of hard to explain. Now, we have a lot of high res available now online, so it might be, say, up to, very commonly, 24 bits and 192 kilohertz. Now, we don't need the total performance of 192 kilohertz audio. I mean, it goes into frequencies we can't hear, but since what the DAC is doing is oversampling anyway, the idea is that you're reducing the amount of actual oversampling needed by providing original samples. The problem is with a lot of analog to digital converters that digitize the music in the first place, they also produce a lot of high frequency noise. So you may have, say, up to about 50 kilohertz where you have music content, if there is any, depending of course on the limitations of the microphones. But then above that, even though you may have a high frequency file that goes up to 192 kilohertz, up to the half the rate of that, say 96 kilohertz, you'll actually have a lot of high frequency noise which you don't want. And so the high frequency filter can cut that. And that means that you might not hear that noise because it's out of band frequency, but it may interfere with the electronics in some way that you can't discern. So it does have a second filter for that. Now, a lot of the music we listen to may be a little bit more harsher and a little bit more aggressive sounding, and perfectly filtering that, well, can be better in some ways, and I'll talk about that in comparisons, and worse in others. So there is a reduced filtering version of both filters, which are the orange and red filters, so that you can soften up the filter just a tad for that slightly more aggressive music, so that maybe lesser quality, say rock music you might listen to, or something where the recording isn't so perfect, and you want to very slightly take the edge off that without reducing, well, significantly reducing the quality. So he provides 2 filters for that. And I have to say those filter differences are very minimal, but can ever so slightly take the edge off without actually distorting the music. Now, the second option, of course, is the input, and you have the inputs on the back here. We have 2 BNC inputs, and we have optical, and we have USB. Now, the USB is galvanically isolated, which is very handy if you have a computer which is outputting some noise as well as the signal. And that's something you don't have in the Hugo 2. And the Hugo 2 couldn't be isolated because if you're using it with portable gear, the isolation may prevent the say your phone or whatever you're hooking up to, recognizing the device. So that's one advantage it has if you're considering between getting a Qutest and a Hugo 2. While you do get a headphone amplifier in the Hugo 2, you don't get any kind of volume control in the Qutest. You just get the DAC. Now, of course, the optical input may be most ideal. It goes, if you have a good optical cable, you can maybe get 192 kilohertz transmission through there, although that's where it starts to get a little bit dicey with optical due to the frequencies and design involved. Although that means you have complete isolation from any electrical noise from your computer or transmission device. So you have good quality USB and good quality optical, but you also have, strangely, two BNC ports. Now, if you're familiar with how Chord gear works, you'll understand why, but the reason for this is that it can be used with Chord's MScaler. Now, Chord's MScaler is a high-frequency upsampler that uses 1 million taps, and that can improve the sound quality of this as well. Now, if you're going to spend something like, $3,000 to $4,000 on an MScaler, and then you're spending, less than $2,000 on the Chord Qutest, that may seem like it has significant disparity. Although, because each of these accepts 384 kilohertz input, you could use other upsampling. The USB will accept 768 kilohertz input if you want to try some high quality upsampling software of your preference instead. Now, some people may be disappointed that the analog outputs are only single-ended. There is no benefit in the way Rob Watts designs his gear to providing balance. Actually, technically, even in the TT2, which I have sitting behind me, then the balanced outputs are technically very slightly inferior because they're converted from the single-ended outputs. But this is very good if you're like me and you like using tube amps, because given the sound quality, which I'll talk about in a bit, this becomes a very good match with something like a tube amp like this Studio 6 sitting behind me. I actually did consider getting a Qutest to use with the Studio 6 because I thought it would be a perfect, simple match and it doesn't take up much space. I'd say one of the factors that tends to overwhelm most digital converter designs is that each of them, especially the chip-based ones, tend to impose their own character over all the music. If you think about it, I live in an area that's where there are a lot of trees. If I go and stand out on my balcony, I can get a feeling of how the nature is. It is nice to be out there amongst all the trees and the birds and all of that. But when I come inside and close the window, while I can see all the trees and I can hear most of the sound, if there is a barrier in between me, and that barrier has its own slight coloration. If I look at the glass slightly to one side, it may look slightly green. If I actually have one of the doors open and both panes of glass are in front of each other, I can see a little bit of coloration in there. That's how it feels listening to music with a lot of digital converters. Or say the AKM ones tend to produce this smooth, like overly smooth sound over all the music. Even the nice 1-bit converters, say with Cayenne's N7, tend to give a little bit of a similar kind of sound, a little bit of smoothness there. And it pervades everything, and it removes very slightly from the uniqueness of each instrument in the music and each singer and everything there. And one of the things I've noticed about Chord DACs is if you hear a trumpet, it sounds individually like that trumpet. If you hear the singer sounds individually like that singer. If you hear drums, the drums sound like drums. And each instrument has its own unique character maintained in the sound, which is something that even the most technically accurate converters don't seem to have, at least if they're chip-based, though I've heard there are some exceptions which I have yet to test. I wanted to jump in here just to quickly talk about this mention of music, in that these experiences I've had with the Qutest and other DACs and Chord gear especially, is that these require high quality recordings. And so it's a good opportunity to talk about today's sponsor, which is Native DSD. Now, I asked them to be a sponsor, well, not just because that benefits my channel, but because I wanted to bring attention to them and the high quality recordings that not only do they make, but they sell from other studios. And they have a very extensive catalog of both high-res recordings and native 1-bit recordings, which were made direct to DSD without any mastering or conversion. So you get the highest quality recording possible. Now, Chord gear processes DSD in a very unique way. Now, DSD, if you're not familiar, runs at a sample rate which is at least 64 times CD quality audio. And the Chord DACs process audio at 2048 times the normal sample rate. And that means that unlike some DACs which have to decimate or downsample the DSD audio to process it, Chord DACs can actually run it at an even higher rate for optimum processing. And one thing Rob Watts has aimed to do with DSD recordings is ensure that they don't have some of the issues you sometimes have with DSD DACs, in that you hear, they sound very soft and the transients are smeared, and this can actually degrade the music, even if it does sound very good to some people. Rob Watts' processing of DSD in the Chord DACs is really fantastic, and especially if you do match it up with some direct DSD 1-bit recordings, the sound can be very amazing, as you hear a lot of emotion from singers, you hear all the nuances of playing, you hear how the strings vibrate on things like guitars and violins and other acoustic instruments. It becomes a really fantastic experience, and I hope that in bringing more attention to native DSD and the recordings that they and other studios make, that will encourage more studios to make these high quality, minimally processed recordings, and so that this will benefit people like ourselves, where we're interested in having high quality gear and getting the best experience possible out of the great audio gear that we have. The Qutest is maybe on resolution terms kind of similar to DACs in its price range, such as this is a original Shit Audio Yggdrasil, so now they cost around, I think it's $2,600–2,700, and with the Qutest being, getting quite a bit cheaper than that, it produces a similar level of sound quality. However, I found that the Shit Yggdrasil tends to give a bit of graininess to vocals in comparison compared to the Qutest. The Qutest tends to be smoother and more even in that regard. But that smoothness doesn't come at the expense of resolution. In other comparisons, for example, we have the more warmer sounding R2R DACs from Audio GD, but their oversampling even so tends to give a bit of something that maybe is not so enjoyable to the sound, and I tend to use them in non-oversampling mode with external upsampling from HQ Player, because the digital filters in HQ Player are much better quality, and I consider that software quite worth it. One of the main characteristics, as I talked about before, is that the Qutest provides a really nice sense of depth to the music. Now, while I usually use speakers to a certain depth, the other headphones which tend to give a very accurate impression of front to back depth are the Focal Utopias, both the original model and this current 2022 version. And that gives me an idea, like if an instrument or something is behind the speakers, you hear it from behind the speakers. If we're close by, where it would be maybe around where the speakers are or in front, then I hear it up close. And I hear everything, while not in super pinpoint accuracy. For super pinpoint accuracy, you have to go up more to the Chord TT2, or especially the Dave, which can, especially with the MScaler, can resolve some pretty crazy things. It does give a fair sense of the depth of the music, while not a perfectly clear one like higher end converters can. It's very comparable actually to the Hugo 2, since essentially it is the same design inside a box but without the volume control, galvanically isolated USB, and without the batteries that are in the Hugo 2. I actually plugged both of them into various amps here and compared them to see if I noticed any particular difference. And between them, using my computer as the power supply for the Qutest and using USB input in one and the 2Go as the source for the Hugo 2, switching back and forth, I couldn't hear any difference. And that gave me to think that what happens if I use a better quality power supply? Now, people have argued online about whether their better quality power supply will influence the Qutest. Due to the high quality of Rob Watts' designs, they tend to be fairly immune to changes in power. If anything, the using of switching power supplies from them tends to send noise back through the ground plane into amplification, and that's where the difference tends to be, not necessarily in the DAC. So what I thought I'd do is I'd plug the USB output into something like an iFi iUSB 3 instead, and then I did switch backwards and forwards between the Hugo 2 and Qutest again, with changing nothing else in my system. Now, initially switching backwards and forwards, I thought, nah, it sounds about the same. But then, after a little bit, I felt, hold on, something feels a little bit different from the Qutest. So I switched back and forth some more, and I felt that ever so slightly the Qutest sounded better. Now, it was a very slight thing, and if you put me under DBT, test conditions where I had to make out a difference and had to be sure, I don't think I could do it. It was very subtle, but it felt maybe slightly better with that better power supply. So there may be a potential that, and I wouldn't go crazy spending hundreds of dollars on improving this, it may be a little better to use a better power supply with the Qutest for better results. Maybe even just a power supply where you can plug in some noise filters as well. So the other improvement people ask about is the MScaler, and it was a jump up definitely using the MScaler with the Qutest. It felt like in stock, now I'm used to of course the TT2, which has a very open sound. Stock, it felt a little bit more closed in and a little bit less well defined than say the TT2 or maybe the other better DACs, but still very nice to listen with. And the MScaler opened that up and made it more pleasant to listen. Now, of course, I don't know if it made it, $3,000-$4,000 or whatever it is for an MScaler more pleasant, but there was definitely a difference there. And that's where it took, because of course the MScaler takes advantage of the dual BNC inputs to produce the maximum sound quality possible. Now, of course, you can experiment and use, high quality upsampling with this, but Rob Watts, of course, and he obviously would say this, will say the MScaler will produce technically the best result, as again, he is aiming to get a perfectly accurate reproduction of music with his designs. But the real killer thing about the Qutest is the price. Now, Chord have just dropped their prices, so the Qutest and other of their components have become real bargains. And what is more, you can actually pick up a lot of these secondhand, and the lowest I've ever seen at given current exchange rates is as little as $1,000 US. And for the sound quality you get in here, which you normally have to spend over $2,000 for, with these big components, which may at least match them or even be better in some cases, means that this is an absolute bargain. Now, it doesn't have any kind of warm or warm and inviting sound like some of these things do. Some people may find it a little bit more on the, I don't want to say cold side, because when we think of cold, we think of, say, maybe an ESS DAC, which has a kind of sharp and cold sound overlaid all over the music. This brings through the music as it is, and it brings through instruments as they are, and it doesn't editorialize, but in that way it brings out the music, the real musicality of the instruments. So, but that does mean that some people may prefer to use this, again, with something like a tube DAC. It works very well and can become very pleasant to listen with. Now, in fact, this Qutest here is actually a second-hand one that was bought by one of my patrons. Patron asked my help in getting hold of this Qutest and allowed me on the way through to give it a review, and I was very curious to find out how it compared to the Hugo 2. And for the amount he paid for it, which again was actually around $1,000, it is an absolute bargain. Now, it doesn't do everything that people, always ask of it, like have, balanced outputs and all that kind of thing. But as a DAC that does the job and is simple and straightforward, I can highly recommend it. So not only would I like to thank my patron who allowed me to review this, I'd also like to thank all my patrons who helped me make these videos. As always, do you own a Qutest or have you owned one? If you have your own opinion on this DAC, do post your experience in the comments below. And so as always, thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you online.